Shalom family trendsetter. In this video, I want y'all to bear with me. First, I'm going to make a disclaimer by saying some of the stuff I'm going to be saying in this particular intro part of the video will be offensive to some and sensitive to others. But nonetheless, it has to be said. Now, I want y'all to understand, family, this Helio-Biblos book we refer to as the Bible has been infiltrated. This is not our original record. I know a lot of y'all Hebrews believe this shit is, but it's not. This book was written by men. Yes, our original record that was written by our ancestors were taken from us. Just like how we was taken from the shores of Africa, brought into this land and other land areas of this world, I refer to as hell, right? They have displaced us, such as how they have displaced our record. Do you really believe, as fucking evil as these devils are, they're going to allow us, after burning us on logs, hanging us on trees, raping our women and children, castrating our men, they're going to give you a book and teach you how to serve your God, your quote unquote God, because I don't deal with God, because God is none other than Satan. I only refer to my power as the Most High power, my creator. So y'all really believe these fucking entities that dwell amongst us are going to give you a book? Oh, do you know that the KKK and the white supremacists, the skinhead, they read out of the same book? They worship the same God you Christian worship? Me, family, I don't throw away the baby with the bathwater, but I tell you this much. I don't put my stock in this Helio-Biblos songbook 100% because I know man wrote the Bible. If the Most High actually gave us a record book, we don't have it today. We're in captivity. These fuckers have given us their God to worship. And I'm going to prove to you today in this video. Keep watching right after my brief intro or commentary. Family, we need to wake up and realize that Christianity have done a number on us. Even us Hebrew Israelite that claim that we are woke, we're still worshiping their son deity that's in the New Testament. The deity that tells you, first of all, to obey your master, your earthly master, turn the other cheek, right? And then this devil tells you in remembrance of him to eat of his body and drink of his blood. Now I'm going to show you something, and if you cannot see the depiction of what he's telling you to do as being something wrong, then I don't know what else to tell y'all. Y'all just need to just go die with the rest of them and shit, for real. Because family, we have been lied to. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob never believed in Jesus Christ. We cannot be held accountable for someone that we never knew, even when we was in captivity. We never knew this motherfucker. This shit was taught to us, embedded in us. So the Most High is not going to hold us accountable for someone that our ancestors never knew of. This Jesus Christ character. Anyway, family, stay tuned. Continue to watch. Shalom.
Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you to win their favor, but also with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you're serving.
Down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. The Jews therefore quarreled among themselves, saying, How can this man give up his flesh to eat? Then Yahshua said to them, Most assuredly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. He who eats this bread will live forever.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy: the Atlantic Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.